My name is Vikki Gunn. I am David's colleague at Seascape Consultants, and I'm going to be talking, or Ben invited me to talk a little bit about capacity development for ocean governance, but specifically I'm going to talk about my experiences in working with stakeholders to get messages across to various different policy fora. I apologise for the format of my slides. They are very heavily iAtlantic branded, which is a project that I currently work on along with Ben and Matt and lots of other colleagues. But my presentation will draw on experiences from a whole load of other projects that I've worked on across the years. I'm a scientist by training, but I actually started life as a mining geologist working in the mineral exploration industry, and I moved across to the marine realm about 20 years ago, working as a project manager in some of the very early multidisciplinary marine science projects that brought together scientists from lots of different scientific fields, so geologists with oceanographers, with marine biologists, with modelers. So it's been a really interesting and exciting 20 years. So I hope I've got some experiences that you will find useful. So moving on, and I hope I can get my slides to go. The first thing to think about, I think, really in this presentation is to consider, what do we mean by stakeholder engagement? So, you know, like many people, I guess, when you're starting to find out the building blocks of a certain subject, you go to Wikipedia, and this is what Wikipedia said. So stakeholder engagement is the process by which an organisation involves people who may be affected by the decisions it makes or who can influence the implementation of its decisions. So I thought, great, okay, so what does that actually really mean for scientists or researchers? So for that, I would say that stakeholder engagement is the process by which scientists or researchers involve people or organisation who may be affected by the results of their scientific research or who can influence the implementation or uptake of those outputs. So in the context of today, we're talking about policymakers, right? So, in other words, getting your messages or results out there so that they can be used to inform decision making. And actually, as we'll see a bit later on, you know, quite often you want it to be a two-way process. So you want to know what policymakers need to know so that you can tailor your research accordingly. So let's have a look at the why, who, when, and how of working with stakeholders. So, you know, why do we want to do it? Who do we need to engage with? When should we do it? And how should we do it? So first of all, why would you want to do this? I mean, presumably everyone on the call today has an interest in this, otherwise you wouldn't be here. So you all want to do it, but there are many reasons why you might want to engage with stakeholders and with policymakers. For most people these days, it's actually a condition of your research grant. So, you know, you have to demonstrate impact. Funders want to know that the research that you're doing is actually relevant and that it's important to society. So that's usually a key reason. Maximising impact, you know, for your own satisfaction as a scientist, you want to know that the work that you're doing is meaningful and is interesting to people outside of your immediate peer group. Working with stakeholders, so people who can take your results and use them to do something else, builds credibility for your work. That dialogue can also provide specific input for your research. So, you know, you may be able to tweak the direction of your experiments or your research or whatever in order to meet a very specific question that your stakeholders might have, or a knowledge gap that they have. And this in itself can open new avenues of collaboration or funding. So, you know, you might find suddenly you've got a great idea for a new project proposal that may have, for example, industry co-funding or so on. Personal satisfaction is a big thing, at least for me. You know, I don't like to do work that, you know, doesn't really have any relevance for anyone other than me. So, you know, and I know, you know, a lot of my colleagues feel the same. We take satisfaction in knowing that we're doing something useful with our time. And, you know, that also lends itself very well to saying, well, you know, it's the right thing to do. You know, if you're doing work, you're being paid to carry out research, you know, it's the right thing to do to share those results with as many people as you can. So now we're coming on to the who. So who are your stakeholders? And there is no one answer that fits this question, because it really depends on what you're trying to achieve, what your interests are, and what field you work in. So I think when you start out trying to think, okay, well, I need to engage with stakeholders, you need to really think quite carefully about who you're trying to reach and why, okay? So, and it can be, you know, anything on a sliding scale, from a very broad group of stakeholders or indeed very focused. So, for example, you might be working on a piece of research which is very relevant for industry, or even a very niche part of industry, but maybe not so interesting for other stakeholder groups like operational organizations or regulators or whatever. So you need to think carefully about who you want to reach, and identify what sort of relationship you want to have with that audience. So are you looking just to put yourself on broadcast and tell them what your results are, or are you looking to have more of a discussional relationship where you involve them very early on in your research process and sort of work together to develop ideas? Do you want to have staged meetings through the course of your research so that they can say, well, that's really interesting, maybe you should develop that a little bit further, or they say, well, actually we already feel that we know everything we want to know about that, so or we work with other groups on that. So identify what sort of relationship you need, whether you want input or whether you just want to be on broadcast. Finding the appropriate experts in your target organisation is really key, because, and I know this is a question that a lot of people have been asking, how do you find that in? But really it's about finding the like-minded person on the other side of the conversation to really build a relationship with. So, you have to do a bit of detective work to find out who the most appropriate person is to talk to. And to do that, I think, maybe one of the very first steps that you have to take is to understand the priorities of your stakeholder organisation. So if it's industry, understand their agendas, where they're operating. If it's policymakers, understand, what are the hot topics, where are the knowledge gaps, what are the really key ideas that they want to take forward, and how can your work help or influence that. So when I do a lot of work supporting the sort of the policy translation of science results, and one of the very first things we usually do when we're starting out in a project is to undertake what I call a stakeholder mapping exercise. So we take a broad view of the stakeholder landscape that's relevant to that project, and we map out exactly where all those organisations sit, what committees they have feeding into their various decision-making processes, when do those committees meet, where do they get their information from, who sits on those committees, who do we know, who amongst the project consortia already has people sitting on these working groups or committees. So we map out where the potential pathways are, and we also look at the results that the project is going to produce and when those results will come out, and we will try and map. It's almost like a matchmaking exercise, if you like, to match project outputs or your research results with the right audience and at the right time. So it has to be at the right time for when your research is mature enough to be able to say something concrete, but it also needs to match your stakeholders' agenda. So, if you do your homework well enough, you will know that, next year a big topic will be X, Y, Z, and therefore you can tailor your messages to really address that agenda, which will get your stakeholders' attention straight away, because they can see that there will be relevance in your work for them. So I've kind of already got onto the when. A good thing to sort of work out quite early on, and some of this is actually limited by the resource that you have either in your research group or within your project or whatever, is whether you're going to wait to the end of your research and go in with like a one-hit wonder, a really big hit, all singing, all dancing, or are you going to have a sort of a drip, drip, drip feed of work? Maybe if you're going for a more conversational relationship with your stakeholders, then obviously then you might program interactions with your stakeholder audiences at specific points. One approach that can be very fruitful, but again, it doesn't work for everyone, is you actually involve your stakeholders right from the very start. So you think, okay, we want to undertake a project on this particular topic. Wouldn't it be great to actually have stakeholder input right at the very start, so that we understand where the knowledge gaps are at the policy coalface, and actually design our research to specifically address those knowledge gaps or those policy needs? So that can be very beneficial. We've already talked about understanding your stakeholders' agenda, the priorities, the calendar of their meetings, when do the major decisions get made. There's always a lead time leading up to those big policy meetings. So, if you've got a document that you want to try and get in front of the policymakers or something like that, you really have to understand how far in advance of that key meeting do those people on those committees sit down and read the documents? So, you know, quite often you can't just turn up to the decision-making meeting and then expect them to take your issue seriously, because the agenda's been set months in advance. Timing must be right for you as well. I mean, you have to be in a position to present your work in a convincing way. You have to be able to substantiate your results. So, you know, they need to be strongly evidenced. And, you know, just don't put yourself in a vulnerable position where if someone asks you a tricky question, you can't answer it. So be confident about your research before you really sort of go hardcore into taking it to your stakeholders. I mean, you know, it's sort of horses for courses, if you like, because, you know, quite often you get a scientific result that is so groundbreaking that actually you want to get it out there as quickly as you can. For others, you know, they like to have the evidence. You know, if there's a lot of data processing that goes into it, for example, you need to make sure that that's robust before you put it up in front of people, because, you know, if it's a slightly controversial result, people will always question it. So you need to put yourself in a good position to be able to evidence your research and defend your results. And there's a lot to be said for being opportunistic and flexible. I mean, we've in our project, we've had lots of success with, you know, a random conversation in a corridor and someone says, well, why don't you come along and present this at a lunchtime seminar at our office or something like that? And you think, well, okay, it's a bit of a pain to, you know, schlep all the way over there. But actually, it's turned out to be a really productive meeting and has led on to many other things. So be open to opportunities and be flexible about how you take these things on. So how? Now, a lot of people have been asking about this. There are lots of ways to get your messages out there, okay? Admittedly, you need to get yourself in the right place at the right time. But other things that we've talked about, picking the right audience, picking your moment, picking the right tools for the job, and we'll get to that in just a second. But I think an overarching message really is that you need to be conscious of using the right language and tone, particularly in policy meetings, because it's very difficult. And I know someone asked this question earlier, you know, if you're always being critical of an industry, for example, or always being critical of a particular aspect of a policy, you'll find that the audience isn't very willing to engage in discourse about it, because, you know, they don't want to get into an argument. So being conscious of language and tone, I think, is really important, and going into these meetings with you know, the attitude that you want to have a constructive dialogue and that you want to find solutions to whatever it is that you might feel is a problem. I think that's really important. And policy meetings in general tend to be very respectful of other people's views. So, you know, don't set yourself up to be the bad guy in the room by always being, you know, the negative speaker. That there's a way to put your point forward without alienating people in the room. And I think a key point, and I have to say that I've learned this the hard way, is you need to make sure that you always have something relevant to say. So if you're turning up to a meeting that has a very specific agenda, make sure that you do your homework first, so that if someone asks you a question or asks you what you think about a certain point, make sure that you actually have something to say, even if it's not a direct answer to the question. At least show that you are knowledgeable about the agenda that's on the table. So some of the tools that you can use when you're getting involved in policy meetings or committee meetings, or, you know, any part of the huge organism that is, you know, the decision-making world. We have just these things in the brightly coloured text there. We have these things called policy briefs, but I also like to talk about science briefs, which are not quite the same thing. Matt already mentioned side events at policy meetings, which is like a little self-contained seminar for the people who are there. You can think about running dedicated stakeholder events. So you could run your own workshop or your own meeting where you talk about your research or specific topics, bring in experts from outside, or be one of those experts that goes along to someone else's stakeholder event. You could set up bilateral meetings. So once you've identified the right person to talk to in a particular organisation, you can say, well, hey, you know, actually I've got some really exciting results here, or some really interesting material that, you know, you might find useful for, you know, whatever work that they're working on. Why don't we set up a lunchtime meeting, or could I come and present at your monthly staff meeting or whatever. You know, there's lots of ways to set up bilateral meetings. So you can be quite creative there. And project co-design, we've already talked about. That's kind of at the other end of the scale, where you have people involved from whatever your key target audience or organisations are. You have them actually involved in designing a research programme or an initiative right from the start. So let's just have a quick look at some of these. So science and policy briefs, I'm sure most of you have either seen one of these, have been involved in writing one of these, or you've come across them on the internet or whatever. They are usually fairly short, concise, usually nice and glossy documents that focus on a specific issue or a specific topic. And they're great. They're brilliant for handing out at various meetings. These days, they're usually available as a PDF online as well, so they have a legacy to them. There is an art to doing them. You know, you see as many bad ones as you see good ones, I have to say. But the main thing is to keep it short and focused, make it look appealing for people to read. Policymakers don't have a lot of time, you know, like researchers, they're pulled in a million different directions. Key messages have to be up front. And then, you know, the best ones that I've seen actually give you the key messages up front. You can delve a little bit deeper in like page 3, 4. And then if you want to go really hardcore, then there's either, you know, some slightly more detailed information in there, or they give you resources to go and find out more, which might be the organisation's own website or published papers in the peer-reviewed literature, for example. So, but the key thing is that they have to be targeted to your audience, so you have to know who you're writing for. So, policy briefs and science briefs, okay? So what I call science briefs are explainers for people who work in the policy world who may not be experts on a particular field of science. So these documents, which we've produced for a number of projects over the years, provide basic information to help policymakers understand why the decisions they're making are important, right? And it also helps them to understand some of the basic concepts that should inform the way that they develop their regulations. So that's what I call science briefs. I would recommend that they are no more than, let's say 4 pages, 6 pages long. They have some nice pictures. They are written in accessible language that non-experts can understand, but they also provide some further reading if people want to go a little bit further into depth. So on the screen there are just some examples of ones that we've done in the long distance past, but they're still in circulation now, and we still have people downloading them from the Legacy Project website, so they're still relevant. My keyboard stopped wanting to advance slides, which is excellent. Hang on a minute, there we go. One step up from that and slightly more involved is what we would call non-technical summaries. So if you've got a larger body of work and you think, well, actually, yes, we could pick out certain aspects from that and write a science brief, but actually much better to be able to give people a more holistic picture of what we've done, then a non-technical summary could be the way forward. So at the end of the project, for example, you would write a summary of, you know, what all the results mean in a whole, in language that's accessible to non-experts, but again, with the resources for people to find out more if they want to, or perhaps even more important than that, your contact details so that they can contact you to find out more. So that way you might find yourself invited to a meeting or asked to provide a comment on certain bits of you know, new legislation that's coming out or so on. So it's a way for stakeholders and policymakers to find out who the experts are in the field and how to get hold of them. So we've done this for a number of projects and they're always quite well received. So those were science briefs and non-technical summaries. Policy briefs are a little bit different. The same principles apply. They've got to be accessible, written well, targeted to the right audience and so on. But what they do is they focus on the specific implications of whatever research it is or whatever message it is that you're getting out, the specific implications of that for policy making. So, you know, rather than just saying, well, the results were this and it's important because we don't know this about that, they will say, well, this is important because actually when you're developing this particular regulation, you will need to take this into account. And if you don't, this is what might happen. So they're subtly different, but I think it's an important difference, okay? Again, they need to be short and snappy. They need to have key messages up front. It helps if they look nice because then people actually want to pick them up and read them. And again, they can be posted online as a PDF or easily circulated via a mailing list. So they can be very, very accessible, okay? So moving on, side events, and I'm conscious that I'm talking for a lot longer than I ought to. Side events are like little seminars at policy meetings. So quite often they take place over lunchtime. It's kind of potluck who turns up, but it helps if you provide food and maybe some drink. So, for example, the BBNJ, the UN Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction process, nearly always had side events at lunchtime. It was always a bit of competition to see who could attract the most people to a particular topic. But also you'll find that some working groups and international committees and so on and so forth make time for this. They make space for this in their meeting agendas. So again, it's about doing your homework and finding out which particular committees are most relevant for your work. The side events can be quite difficult to secure at the very high level meetings because they need to be proposed by a country or a state's party. And quite often what you'll find is that people who have an interest in a common issue or a common topic will club together to do a collaborative side event, and that can be quite good because you all have influence in different places. So your convening power together can be very effective. The key thing to note, though, is that the topic that you want to present on has to be relevant to the meeting agenda. Otherwise, you'll find that people will drift off to other events that are more interesting to the topics that they're going to be discussing in the main meeting. So the pros of these is that you do reach a very high level audience, and they can be very high impact, and it's quite prestigious to be able to say that you've convened or you've presented at a side event. But the cons are that you are usually competing with lots of other events. Usually time is a real pressure and you don't have an awful lot of opportunity for discussion, and it's a bit hit and miss who will actually turn up, but they are a great thing to do or take part in if you have the opportunity. Slightly lower level, if you're working in a project or you have a research grant or whatever, you can organise your own stakeholder event, right? And that means that you are master of your own universe. You can decide what you want to present. You will still have to market it in such a way that people will want to turn up. But it can be anything from, for example, a very formal, what we in the past have called a science policy panel meeting, where we actually have scientists standing up presenting their results, but with a focus on how those results are relevant for particular aspects of policy. That's at one end. You can have something quite informal at the other end. So, for example, the blue picture there is an evening event that we put on during UNFCCC COP26, which was a bit of a show and tell, lots of good imagery in an amazing location, and plenty of drinks to help everyone relax. So, it can be anything in between, but the key thing is that it has to be relevant. The messages you're getting across still have to be relevant. It can be difficult to get people to turn up to these events if they're standalone. So another good trick is to host one of these events in the margins of another meeting where you know that there will already be a critical audience there. So people don't have to make a special journey for this particular event. So that can be really good. And you see there are lots of these sort of stakeholder events and side meetings in the evenings during the big policy events, particularly in New York or at the CBD COPs. So they can be a really good way to make friends and influence people. Bilateral meetings we've covered a fair bit already. This is where you set up specific meetings with groups or organisations that you particularly want to have a conversation with. It allows you to be completely bespoke in how you set them up. It usually focuses on a specific agenda and around very focused points for discussion. And these can be very important for building relationships and partnerships. So it's a much more intimate level of interaction, but they can be very effective. It can open doors to all sorts of other opportunities. But again, you're only reaching one organisation or maybe two organisations at a time. So you may end up having to do multiple events if you want to reach lots of stakeholders via this route. So, getting stakeholders involved in projects, and this sort of touches on the co-design thing again. Another way to get stakeholders involved is to set up an advisory board or some kind of external advisory panel where you bring in people who are not partners on your grant or on your project, but you allow them interaction with the project at specific points, usually once a year or something like that, where they're exposed to the progress of your grant or your project, and then they give feedback on how they think that's going or where the results might be relevant to other groups or organisations. So, for example, iAtlantic, this project that we're involved in looking at ecosystem health across the Atlantic, we have one of these advisory boards, and we're very lucky because all the people involved are very engaged. They always have excellent advice. They're quite honest with their feedback, which is what you want. I mean, you don't really want people just giving you some whiffle waffle because that's what they think you want to hear. And it can be it's a very constructive relationship to have. So if you have scope to set one of these up in a research grant or whatever you're working on, then I would thoroughly recommend it. Does cost a little bit of money sometimes, but quite often you'll find that people from the bigger organisations may travel on their own budget. So it's worth exploring.
Mawa.
Oh, hello. Okay, some final words of wisdom. I don't know who's
Just
talking.
a reminder to our audience to please keep your microphones muted. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, some final words of wisdom. You can read them all on the screen there, and half of these we've covered already, but I would say always be careful when you're dealing with your stakeholders. I mean, if you get into an argument with someone, make sure it's a constructive argument and that you are looking for a solution from that discussion rather than just going in for a fight, because the likelihood is that in your career you will have to maintain those relationships. So try to start off on the right foot. Engagement can take a whole range of different forms, so don't feel that you have to go in for the conference of the party straight off. Go in at the working group level, because ultimately all these organisations have to rely on ground roots information at some point in their architecture. They are looking for new information, raw data to support their decision making processes. So you don't have to aim for the moon every time. And on that note, looking for opportunities to join committees, working groups, reviews. There are lots of public stakeholder consultations on policy processes and so on. So if it's something that you're particularly interested in, then I would recommend that you get stuck in. You can join forces with other projects, initiatives, other researchers that are more experienced than you. That's absolutely a way to go. That's pretty much how I started. Someone says, well, are you interested in this? You ought to come along to this meeting. And yeah, you sit in the back and you just take it all in, but you go to enough of those. And then people start saying, well, what do you think about this? You don't have to start off with a big bang. Key point is to always be clear in your messaging. So policymakers find it difficult to deal with uncertainty. So if you are uncertain about something, I think it's okay to say that, but as long as you can explain why you're uncertain about something and how you will resolve that uncertainty and on what time frame do you expect to be more certain about your results. So as long as you're clear, I think that's good. Be sensitive to your stakeholders' agendas, priorities and challenges. That's absolutely key. Don't go into a policy room without knowing at least something about what they're talking about. And it's good to have a plan, but also be open to opportunities, because quite often they're the most productive way to build relationships. And then finally, I couldn't do a presentation without adding a picture of David in his purple apron costume. You can also have fun with this, right? Because stakeholders are people, and we all like to have a bit of fun once in a while. So these are some photographs from the Ocean Voices event that we did with the CBD back at their COP14 in 2018. And David and I, against our better judgment, took along some inflatable toys. David dressed up as a purple acorn worm, although you wouldn't know it from those photographs. And at some point, I also was dressed up as a turtle, and we had great fun. The picture in the bottom right was a marine spatial planning interactive exercise that we did, and it was chaos, but it was really good fun. And I think of all the policy engagements that we've ever done over the 10 years that we've been working on this, this is probably the one that we will be remembered for. Certainly David in that costume. So just go the extra mile if it takes your fancy. So thank you.